He was never meant to see another sunrise. A Marine, shattered by war, his body a prison of pain, only to be betrayed by the last person on earth he was supposed to trust. Sent off a cliff by his own wife, left to disappear into the vast pine-choked silence of the Montana wilderness. And yet, against all odds, he lived. It wasn't luck that saved him. It was a dog. A German shepherd with scars that ran deeper than his fur. A ghost from the battlefields of a distant land who simply refused to let his partner fall alone. They say that loyalty speaks a language all its own, and this dog's was a roar. It barked through the storm, fought through the lies, and ran through every shadow they cast to silence the truth. This is not merely a story of survival. It is a testament to the kind of love that feels orchestrated by a higher power, the kind of love that stares into the abyss of death itself and does not even blink. Before we begin, we'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from tonight. And if you believe that the loyalty of a dog is a reflection of something divine, please hit that subscribe button and share an amen in the comments below. This story will remain with you, a quiet echo, long after it has ended. The morning air in the mountains cradling Helena, Montana, was thinner than a whisper, sharp with the scent of pine and the distant metallic promise of rain. Wisps of fog clung stubbornly to the shadows of ancient Douglas firs, their long, pale fingers stretching across the winding gravel path that snaked its way from the back porch of the sprawling Riley estate to the overlook known by locals as Eagle's Peak. The sun, hesitant in its ascent, bled a soft gold along the jagged tree line. Birds dared to sing into the quiet, but for Jacob Riley, the quiet was a lie. Jake, at 33, sat motionless in his motorized wheelchair, bundled in a thick olive-green military jacket that draped heavily over his gaunt frame. A black beanie was tugged low over a rugged forehead lined with scars, the most prominent of which ran in a jagged lightning bolt from his left temple to just above his cheekbone. An echo from a roadside bomb that had stolen his legs and a significant piece of his soul in Fallujah 7 years earlier. Despite years of relentless therapy and rehabilitation, Jake never regained full control of his body, but he had learned to navigate the currents of pain with a stoic grace and a quiet, unyielding resistance. His face, usually an impassive mask, was alert today, not from excitement, but from a gnawing, shapeless unease. Clara Riley walked behind him, her hands guiding the chair. She was in her mid-30s, statuesque and pale-skinned, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. Her raven-black hair was pulled into a tight, severe bun that revealed the sharp, elegant angle of her jawline. She moved with the rehearsed precision of a woman who had practiced every gesture, every smile, for an audience. Her beauty, though undeniable, was cold, like polished marble. Once a luxury realtor in Phoenix, a world of glass towers and empty opulence, Clara had met Jake at a veterans fundraiser 2 years ago. The spark had been a flash, the wedding even quicker. Since then, her warmth had retreated like a tide, and Jake began to suspect she had fallen in love not with the man, but with his substantial monthly pension and the sprawling mountain property left to him by his grandfather. Clara's grip on the wheelchair handles tightened as they neared a section of the trail where the trees fell away, revealing a steep, dizzying drop. "We're almost there," she said, her tone as flat and gray as the overcast sky. Jake squinted ahead. "You sure this is safe, Clara? These trails get narrow, and the edge—" "It's fine," she cut in, a sharp edge to her voice. "You always wanted to see the sunrise from Eagle's Peak. Consider it your anniversary gift." Jake let the silence settle between them, heavy and suffocating. Something about her tone. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. But it was empty, as if she wasn't really there, her mind already miles away. Trailing far behind, tethered by a too-short lead to a cedar post back at the house, was Shadow. Shadow was a German shepherd, 6 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with a deep sable coat flecked in ash gray and rust. His amber eyes mirrored every flicker of Jake's emotions with an unnerving accuracy. Shadow had once sniffed out explosives in the most hostile territories on Earth. Now, by Clara's strict rules, he wasn't even allowed in the main house. No dogs in the kitchen, no dogs on the couch, no dogs upstairs. She had drawn the line everywhere, creating invisible fences around Jake's last source of comfort. But Shadow remembered a different life, one of duty and partnership, and he disobeyed in silence. That morning, as soon as Clara wheeled Jake out of the yard, Shadow began to whimper, a low, guttural sound of distress. The moment she was out of sight, he tugged hard against his restraint. The old rope creaked once, twice, then snapped with a sharp crack. Shadow darted through the orchard like a wisp of smoke, his nose low to the ground, his paws silent on the dew-soaked grass, cutting through trails he knew by pure instinct. Up ahead, Jake's chair jolted slightly as the gravel thinned to loose dirt. The drop beside them loomed, sharp and sudden, the pine canopy falling away into a yawning void of mist and stone. Jake gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "Clara, this is close enough." She didn't stop. Her eyes remained locked on the distant horizon, where the sun now crowned the ridge with a defiant, molten gold. Just a few more feet. "Clara, you know what's funny?" she said. And for the first time that morning, she smiled. But it was the kind of smile that chilled the bone, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. This was never supposed to be a life sentence. The marriage, the chair, the dog, the pity. She exhaled slowly, a plume of white in the cold air. "I gave it a shot, Jake." "I really did." Jake felt the tremor in her voice, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from something much darker, something coiled and ready to strike. He turned in his chair, trying to see her face, but she leaned forward with a sudden violent motion and grabbed both armrests. Just then, Shadow burst through the tree line. He was 10 yards away when he saw them, his human perched on the edge of oblivion, and Clara, her shoulders tense, her hands white-knuckled on the chair. He barked once, a sound that was loud, sharp, and desperate, a sound that tore through the mountain quiet. Clara hesitated, but only for a second. Her hands released the brake. Jake's chair lurched forward. "No!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. The gravel under the front wheels crumbled and gave way. Jake's body pitched forward, suddenly, terrifyingly weightless. Shadow lunged, his powerful legs churning, his claws tearing at the earth as he sprinted. But he was too far, too late. There was no scream, just the metallic echo of wheels spinning into nothing, and the whisper of the wind against flesh as it fell. Clara straightened up, calmly wiped her palms on her leggings, and turned. Shadow skidded to a halt, his nails scratching against the bare rock at the cliff's edge. He ran to the precipice and growled, looking down, barking into the void. His ears were pinned back, his eyes wild with a frantic, helpless rage. Clara glanced over her shoulder, startled by his presence. Their eyes met, and for a brief, flickering second, Shadow's body trembled, not with fear, but with a pure, unadulterated fury. Clara turned quickly, almost slipping in her rush to get back down the trail. She didn't look back. The path home was familiar. So was her next step. Call the local VA clinic. Say Jake had an episode, a flashback, and left early for an extended treatment program in Missoula. No one would question her. Not with her voice so calm, her face so composed, her story so carefully rehearsed. Behind her, hidden by the trees and the gathering clouds, Shadow remained on the cliff's edge, his barks echoing unanswered to the sky as the wind began to howl. The sky over Helena had begun to shift, darkening around the edges like a closing fist. The wind picked up, teasing the pine needles into whispering secrets. The morning light, filtered through the thick clouds, painted the mountains in a muted, somber silver. The birds had fallen silent. Something in the air was off balance, as though nature itself had sensed the profound betrayal. Below the precipice at Eagle's Peak, Jacob Riley lay crumpled against a jagged stone outcropping. His wheelchair, miraculously, was wedged between two craggy spires, its metal frame bent and twisted. The fall had bruised his ribs and torn open an old scar on his shoulder. Blood matted his jacket sleeve, and his lips had turned a pale, ghostly white with shock. But he was breathing, still alive, still tethered to the world by fragile threads of pain and defiance. He couldn't feel his legs. He never could. But now a terrifying numbness was creeping into his torso. His back ached from the violent jolt of the halted fall. Breathing came in short, shallow gasps. A gull cried overhead, its call a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. The scent of damp earth and iron was thick in his nostrils. "Shadow," he croaked, his voice thin, barely rising above the rustle of wind through the canyon pines. "Shadow." Above him, the German shepherd paced the cliff's edge, his tail held high, his ears twitching at every sound, his eyes locked on the drop below. Shadow barked once, twice, then turned and bolted back the way they had come, a sable blur against the gray rock. The estate wasn't far, less than half a mile through a narrow switchback that twisted past the old orchard and down into the lower paddocks. He raced through it, leaping fallen logs, ignoring the thorns that scratched at his flanks. The gravel crackled beneath his pads. His breath came in heavy pants, but his focus was absolute. Inside the modest ranch house that sat adjacent to the main estate, Marcus Thorne had just poured his second cup of black coffee. He stood barefoot in the open doorway, his frame tall and wiry, clothed in a worn gray Henley and faded jeans. His hair was short, prematurely silver at the temples, and his hands, strong and calloused, had seen years of war and ranch work. Marcus had been Jake's team leader once, back in the dust and chaos of Afghanistan. Later, after they were both discharged, he had become the caretaker of the Riley land, a promise he'd made to Jake's grandfather. Loyalty came easy to him until Clara moved in. From the very start, Marcus had distrusted her. She was all diamonds and detachment, polite to everyone but never warm, her smile more a calculation than a genuine expression. Jake deserved more than someone who spoke to him as if he were an obligation, a problem to be managed. Still, for Jake's sake, Marcus had kept his opinions mostly to himself. That morning, he'd seen Clara return alone, a smudge of dust on her leggings and a distant, vacant look in her eyes. When he'd asked where Jake was, she'd muttered something about an early rehab appointment and vanished inside the main house. Now, he heard the frantic barking. Shadow barreled across the gravel and skidded to a stop at Marcus's feet, the shepherd's tongue lolling, his chest heaving with a desperate urgency. Without hesitation, Shadow bit at Marcus's sleeve and tugged. Hard. "What the hell, boy?" Marcus dropped his mug, the ceramic shattering on the stone step. "Shadow, what's going on?" Shadow growled, a low rumble in his chest, and pulled again, more insistent this time. His eyes, those amber, almost human eyes, held a look Marcus couldn't ignore. It was pure, raw desperation. Marcus stepped down onto the grass, letting the dog lead the way. Shadow turned and ran, glancing back constantly to make sure the man was following. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and a first aid kit from the porch wall, laced up his boots with frantic speed, and jogged behind. His gut twisted into a tight knot. Something was terribly wrong. He felt it in his bones before he saw anything. The trail narrowed as they ascended the hill. Shadow veered left past a row of ancient pines, leading him to the clearing at Eagle's Peak. Marcus paused as the horizon opened up before him. Then his breath caught in his throat. The earth near the cliff was disturbed. Two parallel grooves were etched into the loose dirt, wheelchair tracks. They ran straight, unwavering, toward the edge. "Oh, God," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. Shadow whined low, then barked again, a sound that was loud and sharp with meaning. Marcus crept forward, his heart thundering against his ribs. He dropped to his knees and peered over the lip of the cliff. For a moment, he saw nothing but a sheer drop of rock and swirling air. Then, just below, a flicker of movement, a glint of metal, a human figure. "Jake!" he called, his voice cracking with a mixture of horror and hope. A pause. Then, as faint as the breeze, a single word. "Marcus." Marcus's eyes widened. "Jesus, you're alive!" "I can't move," Jake's voice broke, thready and weak. "Chair. Stuck. Don't know for how long." "I've got you," Marcus said, his hands already pulling his phone from his pocket. No bars. Of course not. The ridge had always been a dead zone for reception. He shoved it back in his pocket and looked down at Shadow. "Stay. Watch him." Shadow stepped to the very edge, lay down, and peered below, letting out a soft, drawn-out whine of encouragement. Marcus scanned the terrain. He couldn't climb down safely without gear, not with the storm rolling in, but he could run back to the barn. There was an old coil of climbing rope, some harnesses left over from their training days, if it was still intact. He turned and sprinted, his lungs burning, his mind racing. Shadow remained, his body tense, his eyes never leaving Jake, as if his sheer presence, his unwavering vigil, could hold his friend in place against the pull of gravity and the encroaching storm. By the time Marcus Thorne reached the barn, the sky had turned from a pale wash of gray to the color of bruised steel. Clouds were gathering fast over the hills of Helena, swirling like a slow, inevitable reckoning. The scent of ozone filled the air, thick and sharp. The barn sat on the western edge of the Riley property, an old wooden structure with a sagging roof and peeling red paint, but solid where it counted. Inside, dust danced in the slivers of light that spilled from gaps in the siding. Marcus moved with a frantic urgency. He climbed over an overturned wheelbarrow and headed toward a locked supply cabinet near the rear wall. He hadn't opened it in years. When Jake first moved back after the explosion, they had trained together again, just for the sake of movement, of normalcy. Some old gear had been left behind. Marcus reached for the padlock, his fingers trembling, then drove his heavy boot into the latch. It gave with a sharp, splintering snap. Inside, coiled beneath a dusty tarp, lay a harness, a belay device, and a length of climbing rope. It was frayed in places, but still looked sturdy. He took everything. The air grew heavy around him as the wind outside picked up, rattling the old structure. Leaves swirled across the yard, whispering secrets he didn't want to hear. He threw the equipment into the back of his pickup and peeled out of the gravel drive, tires spitting dust behind him as the first fat drops of rain spattered against the windshield. Back at the estate, Clara Riley stood before a wide bathroom mirror, applying mascara with a calculated, steady precision. Her reflection was flawless. Dark, watchful eyes, clean lines, crimson lips, not a single trace of worry. She had already made the call to Jake's physical therapist in Missoula, claiming with a practiced tremor in her voice that her husband had been transferred early that morning for a last-minute extended treatment plan. She had played her role with chilling grace. She had changed into a charcoal pencil skirt, and a cream-colored silk blouse that hugged her figure, her black heels clicking softly across the cold marble floor. There was no panic in her step, only a cold, methodical purpose. She had already folded the wheelchair's travel cover and placed it back in the garage, an artifact of a life she was erasing.
Now, she was on her way to the office of Thad Jenner, a probate lawyer in the town center. Clara had worked with Thad once before when assisting a client with a property purchase. He was in his late 50s, always wore a vest regardless of the weather, and spoke with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had seen every trick in the book.
When Clara arrived, the rain had begun to fall in a steady, relentless sheet. She walked under a sleek black umbrella, her designer purse swinging at her side. The building was a small brick colonial nestled between a bakery and a barbershop. She entered, her heels tapping lightly on the polished hardwood floors. Thad looked up from behind his massive oak desk, raising a single gray brow as she walked in. "Mrs. Riley, I wasn't expecting to see you today. Is everything all right?" She smiled politely, a performance of warmth. "Of course. I just wanted to go over Jacob's trust again. We had discussed making some adjustments in case, circumstances changed." Thad closed his ledger and folded his hands, his gaze steady. "You mean, in the event that he passes?" She gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod. "Or is declared missing. I've been told such clauses can be triggered without a death certificate, given enough time." Thad's gaze sharpened. "Mrs. Riley, forgive me, but isn't Jacob due for a checkup today? I thought he had another 6 months of rehab scheduled with Dr. Aris." "He was moved this morning to Missoula for specialized care," she replied quickly, her voice smooth as glass. "There was a change in his treatment plan. I didn't have time to notify everyone." "And he authorized that transfer?" Thad asked, his voice neutral but probing. "He's been struggling," she said, allowing a subtle tremble to enter her voice, mentally. "He needed a break, some space." Thad leaned back slowly in his leather chair, the old springs groaning. "You'll need medical records for that, Clara. Signed forms, witness transfers. If we're going to act on any clause in that trust, especially anything involving a disbursement of assets, we are going to need a great deal more than your word." She smiled again, a touch cooler this time. "Of course. I'm already working on getting everything sent over. I just wanted to be proactive." Thad didn't return the smile. He watched her leave, his eyes narrowing slightly as the door shut behind her, the little bell above it tinkling softly, mockingly. Back on the mountain trail, Marcus pulled his truck off the road and jogged the last stretch back toward Eagle's Peak. The rain had thickened to a misting sheet, and thunder grumbled ominously in the distance. Shadow was still at the cliff's edge, his tail curled, soaked to the bone but unmoved, a stoic sentinel. He rose to meet Marcus with a short, urgent bark, then returned to his perch, his eyes still locked on the drop below. "Good boy," Marcus muttered, laying the gear out in the wet grass. His hands moved quickly, clipping the carabiners, checking the knots with the muscle memory of 100 training exercises. The rope was old, but he had doubled it up. He wasn't about to gamble with Jake's life. He slipped into the harness, gritting his teeth against the cold rain that now soaked his collar and sleeves. The rock had turned slick, the dirt a soft, sucking mud. He looped the belay around a thick pine trunk and tested the tension. It held. "Hold the line, Shadow," he whispered as he backed toward the edge. He descended slowly, his boots finding shallow toeholds as he rappelled down the slick rock face. Each meter felt like a mile. Water ran down the cliffside in thin, icy streams, making the stone feel alive and shivering beneath his feet. Lightning forked across the sky behind him, illuminating the gray, unforgiving world in sharp relief. When he reached the outcropping, He saw Jake slumped against the boulder, his lips cracked, his skin pale and clammy. His eyes fluttered open as Marcus dropped beside him. "Back already?" Jake rasped, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Shut up," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt to check his pulse. It was thready, but it was there. "You're lucky you're not dead. Hold still." Shadow barked again from above them, a sharp, proud cry that cut through the roar of the wind. Marcus reached into the pouch on his belt, pulled out a thermal blanket, and tucked it tightly around Jake. He clicked his radio. Static, no signal. "You're going to be fine," he muttered, more to himself than to Jake. "I've got you." The rain intensified, sheets of water hammering the rocks around them. Marcus tightened the straps around Jake and connected the second rope. "This is going to be the worst elevator ride of your life, brother." He looked up to the blur of gray above. Shadow's silhouette waited, unwavering, the only clear and certain shape in a world consumed by storm. The emergency room at Helena General Hospital glowed under sterile white lights, humming with a quiet, controlled urgency. Nurses in navy scrubs moved like whispers across the linoleum floors, their faces composed, their voices calm. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, but the scent of wet pines still clung to those who'd walked in from it. Jacob Riley was wheeled in by Marcus, his unconscious body limp beneath layers of soaked thermal blankets. Blood stained the corner of his jacket, and his face was a pale canvas of exhaustion and trauma. Marcus limped behind the stretcher, his boots leaving muddy tracks, his shirt plastered to his chest. He didn't say much, just barked out the essential facts. Marine vet, spinal injury, potential hypothermia, head trauma, before stepping aside and letting the medical staff swarm around his friend. Shadow followed close behind him, his wet fur matted, his ears pinned back, his amber eyes burning with a silent desperation. A security guard at the entrance started to block the dog, a hand raised in a gesture of authority, but Marcus stepped between them, his body a solid wall. "He stays," Marcus growled, his voice leaving no room for argument. "He's not a pet." "That dog's half the reason that man's still breathing." Reluctantly, the nurse on duty, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded. Shadow settled beside the stretcher, dripping water onto the polished floor, his gaze never leaving Jake. Down the hall, Clara Riley stood in a marbled waiting area, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her white blouse was pristine, tucked neatly into slacks that hadn't seen a speck of dirt in weeks. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her heels clicked lightly against the tile as she paced. She had arrived only moments earlier, feigning shock and hysteria after receiving a call from a hospital staffer, saying her husband had been found injured near their property. She had driven in silence, rehearsing her grief, perfecting the art of the devastated wife. A police officer entered the room, Detective Harding. She was in her early 40s, tall and angular with deep brown skin and short, curly hair tucked under a Helena PD cap. Harding was a veteran of the force, known for her restraint and her keen perception. She approached Clara slowly, observing the woman's posture, the smoothness of her voice, the details that told the real story. "I understand your husband was scheduled to begin treatment in Missoula this morning," she asked, her voice calm and even. Clara blinked, her eyes wide with feigned confusion. "Yes, that's right. He left early. I didn't expect to hear from anyone until later today." "And you didn't accompany him?" "He insisted on going alone," Clara replied, her voice a shade too smooth, too practiced. "He needed space. He's been distant lately." Harding scribbled a note in her pad. "And you didn't think to call the center when he didn't check in this afternoon?" Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. I assumed he had arrived safely. I didn't want to crowd him. Harding nodded slowly, her eyes searching, missing nothing. In the ER? Shadow suddenly growled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the room. The dog's entire body went rigid as Clara entered the trauma bay, her mask of concern perfectly in place. His fur bristled along his spine and his lips peeled back over his teeth. The nurses froze. Shadow stepped between Clara and the hospital bed, his tail stiff, his muscles coiled, his eyes narrowed to slits of amber fire. "Call him off," Clara said sharply, taking an involuntary step back, her composure finally cracking. Marcus raised a single eyebrow from the corner where he stood. "That's not how he works. He's trained to detect threats." The lead nurse looked from the snarling dog to the unconscious man on the bed, then back at Clara. "This is a sterile medical zone, but if that animal is reacting like that, there's probably a damn good reason." Shadow lunged, not to attack, but to plant himself directly beside Jake. His body arched protectively, a living shield. His eyes never left Clara. Detective Harding entered then, catching the tail end of the tense scene. She watched the dog for a long, silent beat, then turned her gaze to Clara. "Looks like someone's got a sense about you, Mrs. Riley." Clara's smile faltered for just a breath, a tiny crack in her perfect facade. Elsewhere, under the forest canopy still dripping from the storm, Officer Cole Renair examined the trail leading toward Eagle's Peak. He knelt at the edge of the cliff, his flashlight beam grazing over two parallel grooves, distinct, clean, and unmistakable in the soft mud. Wheelchair tracks. Beside them, the soil was disturbed, scuffed. The grooves didn't end with a turn or a skid. They ended abruptly, at the edge of nothing. Renair's partner, a younger officer named Diaz, approached. "You think he just fell?" Renair shook his head, his face grim. "Doesn't look like a fall. This looks like he was pushed. Straight over?" "Want me to report it in?" Renair stood slowly, wiping the mud from his glove. "No, not yet. Let's keep this close to the vest until we know what the chief wants." Back at the hospital, Clara sat stiffly in the waiting room, the storm of the dog's reaction still playing in her head. Her fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on her knee, her heel bouncing against the floor. She hadn't slept well in days. Ever since the morning she'd returned from the cliff, she'd started seeing Shadow in her dreams, his amber eyes watching her from the darkness, sometimes barking, sometimes growling, sometimes just silent and still as a statue, but always there, accusing. Now, even when she closed her eyes in the harsh daylight of the hospital, his gaze followed her. In the trauma bay, Jake stirred. His eyelids fluttered open under the harsh fluorescence. A heart monitor beeped a soft, steady rhythm beside him. He blinked slowly, his dry lips parting. Shadow whined softly, placing his heavy paw gently on the side of the bed. Marcus leaned closer. "Jake, you with me?" Jake's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. "Shadow, who?" "Not, I'm here, brother," Marcus said quickly. "We got you out." Jake's brow furrowed with a painful effort. She pushed me." Marcus's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "We figured—" A quiet shuffle behind the curtain, and Detective Harding stepped in. She stood silently at first, letting the words hang in the sterile air, then retrieved her notepad. Jake turned his head slowly, his movements weak but his gaze focused. "It wasn't an accident. I didn't fall." "Who did it, Mr. Riley?" Harding asked, her tone soft but firm. Jake's eyes closed briefly, then opened, clear and certain. "Clara." Shadow let out a soft growl, as if confirming the name he already knew. Harding wrote it down without expression. "Thank you, Mr. Riley." Outside, the lightning had faded to a distant memory, but the wind still whispered through the eaves of the hospital like a warning of the storm that was yet to come. Helena's dawn rose behind a veil of low-hanging fog, its pale light seeping into the pine-shrouded hills like a secret trying to surface. The hospital sat quiet but tense, a hum of restrained activity coursing beneath the fluorescent lights. In room 214, Jacob Riley lay propped up slightly by pillows, a faint blush of color having returned to his cheeks. His bandaged head bore the angry mark of a gash just above his brow, and the monitor beside him beeped with a steady, reassuring rhythm. At his feet, Shadow lay curled up, one ear perked, half asleep but never fully resting, a furry, breathing guardian. Jake stared out the window, his thoughts far from the sterile room. His mind returned again and again to the moment Clara's hands left the back of his chair. The raw, chilling betrayal, the absolute absence of hesitation, the cold emptiness in her eyes. Marcus Thorne entered quietly, holding 2 steaming coffees, dressed in a gray zip-up and jeans. His broad shoulders were tense despite the casual outfit. His salt and pepper hair was still damp from an early walk with Shadow in the hospital courtyard. "Still no sleep?" Marcus asked, handing him a cup. Jake managed a half smile. "Hard to sleep when your last nap almost became permanent." Marcus chuckled darkly. "That's one way to say it." Moments later, the door creaked again. Sophia Rossi, the housekeeper from the Riley estate, entered with cautious steps. In her late 50s, she was a small, wiry woman with olive-toned skin, long gray-black hair tied in a tight braid, and the kind of quiet strength built from years of labor and silent observation. She had worked for Jake's grandfather for over 20 years and viewed Jake as the son she never had. Her eyes, dark and sharp, darted between Jake and Marcus. "Senor Jacob," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I have something you need to see." She held out a plain manila envelope. Inside were several printed pages, doctored medical documents that Jake didn't recognize but bore his forged signature, and more damning still, a printed transcript of a voicemail Sophia had secretly recorded just days earlier. "She left this on my phone by accident. Or maybe she thought I couldn't understand her English," Sophia said, her lips tightening. "But I did. I understood every single word." Marcus scanned the sheet, his eyes widening in disbelief. "When he dies, I'll be the one to sign all the necessary documents." "Jesus." Sophia nodded, her expression grim. "She said it like it was already done, like she had already buried you in her mind." Outside, Detective Janelle Harding leaned against her cruiser near the hospital's emergency exit. Her coat collar was turned up against the morning cold, and her fingers drummed softly against her notepad. Harding had already received the preliminary report from Officer Renair about the trail evidence, the tracks that went straight to the edge. And now, with Sophia's envelope in her hand, she had the final damning piece of the puzzle. She had what she needed. That night, at exactly 9:42 p.m., a cruiser pulled silently into the long gravel driveway of the Riley estate. Clara was in the study, sipping a glass of chilled white wine in a navy silk robe, scrolling through her phone as if nothing in her world had unraveled. She barely looked up when the knock came, firm and authoritative. "Officers," she said, standing tall, her chin tilted in a gesture of annoyed elegance. Her voice was a purr. "If this is about Jacob, I already told Detective Harding everything I know." Harding stepped forward, her face unreadable. "Clara Riley, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of your husband, fraud, and the falsification of legal documents." Clara blinked, a flicker of genuine shock in her eyes. "Excuse me?" Her voice remained composed, but a tiny tremor started at the corners of her mouth. "This is ridiculous. You have absolutely no proof." Harding handed her the printed voicemail transcript and the forged medical plans. These say otherwise. Sophia stood just behind the officer line, her arms folded, her gaze steady and unwavering. Clara's eyes met hers, and in that moment, there was no hatred, only a cold, stunned disbelief at being outplayed by the woman she had always dismissed as part of the furniture. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the silent, opulent study. Clara's smirk finally faded, replaced by a mask of raw fury. "You can't do this." "I haven't done anything." "You did plenty," Harding replied, her voice flat. They walked her out under the cover of darkness, past the statuesque silent pines, the cold wind whistling through them like a final judgment. There were no reporters, no curious neighbors, just the profound silence of justice being carried out. Meanwhile, at the Helena Veterans Recovery Center, Jake was transferred to a private recovery suite reserved for those with high-profile injuries. The center was clean and warm, decorated with flags and handwritten notes from schoolchildren pinned to bulletin boards. The lead therapist assigned to Jake was Dr. Aris Thorne, Marcus's younger brother, a man in his early 40s with russet curls tucked into a loose bun and a reputation for being both stern and deeply intuitive. He studied Jake's chart, his expression thoughtful. "Trauma, spinal damage, but you're stable. You're a lucky man, Jake." "I don't feel lucky," Jake muttered, his gaze fixed on the sterile white wall. "You should," Aris said gently. "That dog of yours saved your life." Shadow lifted his head at the sound of his voice. Aris leaned down and scratched behind his ears, a gesture of deep respect. "Official policy says no animals are allowed in recovery suites, but he stays," he said simply. Marcus, seated in the corner, gave a small, grateful nod. "He's not just a dog. He's the whole damn story." By morning, local news outlets had already caught wind of what had happened. The headline on the front page of the Helena Times read, "Local veteran thrown from cliff survives. Loyal K9 hailed as hero." The story spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. Within hours, national blogs and news networks had picked it up. Hashtags started trending. Hashtag Shadow the Hero. Hashtag Justice for Jake. Hashtag K9 Saves Marine. The story struck a deep chord with the public, not just because of the shocking betrayal, but because of Shadow, the retired war dog turned devoted companion who refused to let his handler go. Veteran support groups reposted the article. Former Marines and Army officers from around the country sent letters and emails to the hospital. Even a retired general wrote a personal letter to commend Jake's resilience and Shadow's unwavering loyalty. One young nurse, Haley Prescott, brought in a folded American flag and set it on the windowsill beside Jake's bed. "For him," she said, nodding toward Shadow. "Because he served, too." Jake looked at her, a wave of emotion swelling behind his tired eyes. "Thank you." Shadow nuzzled the folded flag gently with his nose, a silent acknowledgement of a duty he had never forgotten. The final scene took place months later. The wind in Helena had softened. The late spring sun painted the sky in shades of peach and rose as it dipped behind the hilltops. A dirt road led up to a modest wooden cabin perched above a field of wildflowers. The type of home built not with wealth, but with love, patience, and calloused hands. There were no gates, no high walls. Just a simple place with an open porch, a ramp leading to the door, and the steady, gentle sound of wind chimes clinking like distant laughter. Jacob Riley sat on the porch in his wheelchair, wrapped in a flannel blanket, a mug of lukewarm coffee resting in his hand. His hair had grown a bit longer, and the beard he used to keep meticulously shaved was now full and silvering at the chin. The deep lines on his face told a story of both profound pain and incredible survival. But his eyes, sharp, bright and unshaken, reflected a man who had stepped through fire and found his way back to the light. Beside him, Shadow lay with his head resting gently on Jake's thigh. The German shepherd's coat glistened in the evening light, healed from old scratches and scabs, his muscles taut and powerful beneath the fur. He was no longer confined to the cold porch of an empty mansion. Now, he had a large, comfortable dog bed right beside Jake's bedroom window, where he slept, but rarely stayed. His place was next to Jake, always. The cabin had been a gift. After Clara's swift conviction, word of the trial had spread far and wide. Donations poured in from veterans groups, local carpenters, and even complete strangers from across the state who had been touched by their story. Marcus Thorne had taken charge of the construction, refusing a single penny for his labor. He showed up every morning in his worn boots and tool belt, hammering and sawing alongside anyone who came to help, building a home from the ashes of a life that had been destroyed. Now Marcus came by most evenings, always with a six-pack of beer and a new story to tell. On this particular day, he was late. Jake didn't mind. He enjoyed the quiet, the way the porch creaked under the weight of memory and renewal, the chirps of crickets in the distance, and the constant, reassuring presence of Shadow. Inside the house, on the living room wall, hung a small, simple frame. It held a photograph of Jake in his dusty uniform, his arms around his Marine brothers, with Shadow, still a young pup in training, sitting proudly by his side. Below it was another photo, taken just last week. Jake was holding a small boy in his arms while Shadow sat close, his tongue lolling, his ears perked. The boy's name was Leo. Leo was 7, with cerebral palsy and an impossibly bright, infectious smile. He was part of a local therapy group for the children of veterans. His mother, Dr. Elena Evans, was a single mom who worked as a child psychologist at the very center where Jake now volunteered. She was in her mid-30s, petite with curly chestnut hair, always pulled into a messy bun, and reading glasses that never seemed to stay put on her nose. Quiet and observant, Elena had first brought Leo to the group reluctantly, unsure how he would fit in. But the moment Leo saw Shadow, something shifted in the boy's world. He had reached out a wobbly, uncertain hand, and Shadow, as if understanding everything, had walked gently up to him and nuzzled it. From then on, Leo called Shadow his guardian ranger. Jake had taken a liking to Leo instantly. At first, he was unsure how to speak to children, especially one with medical needs. But Leo's unfiltered questions and easy, bubbling laughter had melted those doubts away. They played simple games in the garden. Shadow would let Leo throw sticks, though he rarely chased them. Instead, he'd nudge them back slowly with his nose so the boy could try again. "Leo is going to be the next little warrior," Jake had said during one of their sessions. "He's braver than I ever was." The therapy group had welcomed Jake and Shadow with open arms. Dr. Margot Lennox, a trauma specialist in her early 50s with kind eyes and a penchant for floral scarves, invited them weekly to share their story with veterans struggling with PTSD. Shadow had become something of a legend in those circles, calming, attentive, and alert to the invisible wounds that so many carried. Not long ago, a Vietnam vet named Joseph, grizzled, withdrawn, and always standing apart from the others, had burst into tears after Shadow simply sat by his side without being called. "I haven't let anyone touch me in 20 years, he'd whispered, his hand shaking as he scratched behind Shadow's ear. Back on the porch, the golden light was fading. Jake took a breath, deep and full. It no longer hurt to breathe, not in the way it used to. He reached down and scratched Shadow behind the neck. "You knew before I did," he murmured, his voice soft. "You knew something was wrong." "You always did." Shadow's ears flicked in acknowledgement. A moment later, the front gate creaked, and Marcus emerged up the path, carrying 2 bags of groceries and a worn leather journal under his arm. "You're late," Jake said with a grin. "I was collecting more of your fan mail," Marcus said, tossing the journal onto Jake's lap. "A dozen more letters from high school kids who saw the story online. One of them wants to write a report on Shadow for a class project." Jake chuckled. "He better get my name right, too." As the 2 men laughed, the sky grew darker. Stars began to appear like pinpricks in deep blue velvet. Shadow shifted, laying his full weight protectively against Jake's feet. Marcus stood and looked out over the darkened hills. "Crazy how things change. A year ago I thought I'd be burying you." "You almost did," Jake replied softly, "but you didn't." Comfortable silence fell between them again. After Marcus went inside to start dinner, Jake remained on the porch. Shadow didn't move. Together they watched as the last blush of daylight slipped behind the hills, leaving the world to the moon and the stars. Jake spoke aloud, his voice carried on the gentle night breeze. Not to Marcus, not to the world, but to something larger, deeper. "I lost everything. My legs, my marriage, my pride. But God, you gave me this. You gave me a friend who never left, and a reason to live again." Shadow tilted his head up slightly, pressing his cool nose against Jake's arm. "And you," Jake whispered, his voice thick with an emotion too profound for words. "You're more than a dog. You're a miracle. Sometimes God doesn't stop the storm. He walks with us through it." Jacob Riley lost everything the world values: strength, pride, even his ability to walk. But what he gained in the aftermath was something far more powerful: a loyal friend, a renewed purpose, and a second chance at a life filled with meaning. That is the quiet miracle so many of us overlook. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a living, breathing reminder that when others abandon us, God often sends help in the most unexpected and beautiful forms. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a stranger, and maybe, just maybe, it's a dog. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who might need a ray of hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, or simply type Amen to stand with Jake and Shadow in prayer. And please, don't forget to subscribe for more true and inspiring stories of faith, healing, and the unexpected heroes who walk among us. May God bless you and guide you through your own journey. Type Amen if you believe in second chances.